Welcome to part 2 of this two-part tutorial series on airbrushing miniatures. Part 1 focused on the before you buy knowledge that you should have before jumping into airbrushing. This video will focus on the after you buy process, techniques, and getting familiar with your airbrush. So stay tuned, I have a lot to share with you. This video covers a number of topics and you may already have some of these skills. So I've added chapter markers if you want to jump straight to the topics that interest you. Understanding your airbrush. First thing I recommend doing is actually partially dismantling your airbrush. You are not going to get very far if you are not familiar with all the parts and how they fit together. I'm not going to fully dismantle them as I have never had any reason to remove the trigger to date, but one thing you will need to do regularly is remove the needle and clean the nozzle. So knowing how to access both is super important. I have two airbrushes here. They're similar but differ slightly, so I'll show you how to dismantle both of them and put them back together. Start by unscrewing the back cover. This cover does not need to be on the airbrush for it to function. It is mostly aesthetic, however you can see on the first airbrush that it's possible to screw the end of it to restrict how far back the trigger can be pulled. This may be useful for certain projects, but I haven't had a use for it yet. Once the back is off, you'll see the needle and the screw that clamps it in place. To remove, loosen the screw and pull the needle through. Be very careful as the tip of the needle is very easy to damage and its performance will degrade quite significantly if it is damaged. Now that you know how to remove the needle, let's have a look at the front of the airbrush. There is a cap on the front that helps protect the front of the needle. I recommend keeping this cap on unless you're doing detailed spraying and need to see exactly where the needle is located. The next screw cap covers the nozzle. This here is the nozzle. You need a tool that comes with the airbrush to remove it on this particular one. However, there are airbrushes like this one over here where the nozzle sits loosely in the chamber. This can be helpful if you want to remove the needle via the front of the airbrush to avoid dragging paint through the internals, as this area is often harder to clean. To reassemble, simply work through everything in the opposite order and screw it all back together. When putting the needle back in, make sure it is pushed as far as it will go forward before screwing it shut. Otherwise you may have unwanted paint spraying when you are not pulling back on the trigger. If you are not entirely comfortable with how these pieces fit together, I recommend repeating the process a few times until you are comfortable with it. When you are using the airbrush, you should be removing the needle to wipe it off on paper towel somewhat regularly, at least before packing the airbrush away after each session. You may not need to clean the nozzle every time you use the airbrush, but if you're experiencing clogging, which is common when you first start using it, then it's good to know how. Alright, so with your airbrush fully reassembled, the next thing you need to do is hook it up to your compressor with your air hose. As mentioned in the last video, I use plumbing tape to make sure that my seals are as strong as possible, but don't stress if you don't have any. Next, switch the air compressor on and keep an eye on the air pressure gauge. The air pressure you require depends on what you are doing, and also the individual traits of your airbrush. It is mostly trial and error to find the right air pressure. Generally I wouldn't recommend going below 20 psi. I know some people who base coat as high as 45 psi, but I feel most comfortable somewhere around 28 psi. Once you decide what air pressure you want to start at, pull this upwards and turn clockwise to increase the pressure and counterclockwise to decrease pressure. Note that this will not take effect instantly. If you're going from a higher pressure down, you'll need to release some of the air before it will drop down. To do this, just press down on your airbrush trigger. You do not need to pull back on the trigger, just push it down. Once that is all set, push the regulator valve back down and lock it into place. So I'll be starting at 28 psi. Okay, now your airbrush is all set up and ready for use. Airbrush Technique. So this is what is called a dual action airbrush. It is called dual action because the trigger controls two things: the airflow by pressing down and the paint flow by pulling back. The technique I want you to learn is pressing down to start the flow of air, pulling back to spray your paint, then while you're still holding it down, move the trigger forward again, and then you can release. That's down, back, forward, up. Try repeating this process a few times to get used to it. One thing that beginners tend to do is go straight into a down and back motion and then instantly release. This may cause you a few problems. Firstly, if the paint is flowing before the air is at its full velocity, then you're likely to splatter paint, which can quickly ruin your paint job. Secondly, there is an issue called dry tip. You may think the airbrush is clogging because it is behaving that way, but really, because you didn't stop the flow of paint before stopping the air, it has caused paint to dry around the tip, and now the airbrush isn't functioning. This is easily fixed by gently picking the paint off the needle, being super careful not to damage the needle, but it can be avoided almost entirely by working on this technique. Down, back, forward, up. Next, you need to get a feel for how much you press down and how much you pull back. It will affect both the flow of paint and how wide your spray circle is. To make it really simple, try putting some plain tap water into your airbrush, then try spraying it on a piece of paper towel. To do this, remove the cap from the top of the cup, pour some water in. Since water doesn't dry out like paint, you can leave this cap off while you are practicing. Continue this process until you are comfortable. Using water is a great way to get familiar with the airbrush without accidentally clogging it. Avoiding clogs. Before putting paint in the airbrush, I want to go over the main reasons for clogs. The two most common ones are dry tip. As I've already mentioned, this is when paint dries on the tip of the needle. This is easy to clean off, and with proper techniques you shouldn't have to do that very often. The other is the cup cap being blocked. In the center of the cap over the airbrush cup, you'll see a small hole. As you switch paint around in the cup while painting, it is possible to clog this hole, which will stop the flow of paint. All you need to do is clean the cap off and you should be good to go again. Some other reasons for clogs may include not thinning your paints enough. Most tutorials state that you should be using somewhere between 2 and 8 drops of thinner depending on the thickness of your paint. There is no harm in using a lot more than that. Sometimes I go as high as a 50-50 ratio of paint and thinner, and that's even with paints that are designed to go through the airbrush. The more you thin the paint, the easier it will be to work with, and the less likely it will dry in the nozzle. And seriously, this batch that I'm working on here, I did not open the cap of my airbrush for an hour, and it was still spraying perfectly. No problems at all and nice clean coverage. This also leads into another issue: paint drying in the airbrush. This can occur in paints that weren't designed for an airbrush, not cleaning the airbrush thoroughly, or spraying for a while without the cap on the airbrush cup. Now, in saying all this, it is totally normal for you to clog your airbrush the first few times or even the first few weeks of using it. It takes time to get familiar with the exact conditions and usage techniques that can help you avoid these issues. Starting to paint. Okay, it's finally time to start painting. If you want to mix your paints and thinner the best practice way, then you can do it in a small cup and pour it into the airbrush, or put both in the airbrush cup and stir with a brush. The naughty way, which is what I do, is put both in the airbrush cup, cover the front cap with a finger, making sure not to stab yourself with the needle. Then with the trigger, give it a tiny bit of air and pull back very gently. If you did this right, then you'll see bubbles and you'll be mixing the contents of the cup with air. The reason I call this the naughty way is that it's possible to also force paint back into your airbrush to places that you don't want the paint to go. So if you're finding that the trigger sticks after using the airbrush, then perhaps avoid using this method. The painting process itself just follows the same process you use with the water. Working out things like how far you need to be from the model and how much pressure is just right, how not to overdo it and have paint running down your model. All of these things come with practice and patience. I don't have any magic tricks for this part of the instruction, it's all experimental from practice. Cleaning the airbrush between paints. Okay, so you've either run out of paint, you want to dump the paint that you have and change colour. What do? First, add some water to the cup, backflow by covering the front cap as we showed before, then dump the liquid into a cup to discard it. Repeat this process until you're not seeing a lot of pigment in the water anymore. Then spray some through the nozzle to clear any paint that's in the nozzle. I try to backflow and dump it a few times before spraying it through the nozzle, just so that any big paint particles don't get stuck in the nozzle. If the spray looks abnormal, then you may have to remove the needle at this point and wipe it off. If not, then you're safe to throw in the next colour or refill. Easy as that. You shouldn't be too intimidated by this cleaning process. It's fairly simple once you've done it a few times. Cleaning the airbrush when you finish using it. The process is similar to the previous step, except this time you definitely want to remove the needle, wipe it off and reassemble. I'm also going to use some airbrush cleaner now. Backflow and make sure you're wearing a mask for this. Dump the cleaner, add a tiny bit more and fire it through the airbrush into your cleaning pot. Then I normally do one more round with water just to make sure that the cleaning solution is all out. If some paints are being particularly stubborn, you may need to remove the nozzle and use either your needle or a cleaning needle to try and loosen and remove any paint. I've seen some people choose to soak the airbrush in cleaning solution. I generally advise against this. The cleaner can damage the airbrush if left inside it too long. You can lose the top layers of the metal coating, which causes all sorts of problems, excess clogging and all round worse performance. So I don't like to risk that too much. To recap, we looked at how to set up the airbrush, set the compressor PSI, how to practice the technique, avoid clogging, use the airbrush and effectively clean the airbrush. So what's next? I recommend a lot of practice. Base coating miniatures not only looks great, but is a great way to practice without having to be super accurate. Same with varnishing. If you want to improve your accuracy, then you may wish to grab a canvas and start trying to draw a picture, getting the strokes as accurate as possible. Practice going from wide strokes to narrow strokes and doing big and small circles will help a lot in this process. This will help you improve your accuracy and control, which is a great way to step up to painting individual parts of a model in different colours. I hope you enjoyed this two-part series. The next two-part series that I'd like to do is on 3D printing. I also do painting guides and other tutorials, as well as developing an iOS app for tracking your hobby progress. So if any of this sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell. I really appreciate the support, and it helps me bring you more content more often. If you have any further questions that I haven't answered in this video, please leave a comment below and I'll do my best to help you out. Thank you for watching and enjoy your new airbrush.